Harvard's brightest gave up on the capset problem. But an 11-year-old janitor's son, with folded paper and a second-hand notebook, saw what none of them had. You don't even know what Mod 3 means. Professor Samuel Whitmore's voice echoed sharply through Maxwell Hall's lecture theater. The whiteboard marker struck the tray with a clatter. For a moment, everything froze. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, the only sound in the room. 21 graduate students sat in a semicircle, pens poised mid-air, unsure whether the outburst was directed at them. But it wasn't. Not exactly. In the back row, where the wooden seats were older and less polished, sat a small figure, a boy no older than 11. He wore an oversized green t-shirt with a faded math camp logo and sneakers patched with duct tape. His blonde hair curled faintly from the summer humidity, and his blue eyes, wide, unblinking, stayed locked on the board, reading it line by line. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't moved. But he was there. And that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle Professor Whitmore. Noah Bennett had come with his mother that night, as he often did. Grace Bennett worked Harvard's evening cleaning shift, 3 nights a week at Maxwell Hall. The pay wasn't much, $12 an hour, but it kept the lights on and food in the fridge. Babysitters, on the other hand, were expensive, and Noah was quiet. So she brought him. Always after dinner, always with a backpack full of second-hand books salvaged from thrift stores and donation bins. Books with worn covers, dog-eared pages, and the names of strangers scribbled on the inside. Books others had long since discarded. But to Noah, they were treasure. That night, room 2011 had been left unlocked. The seminar on additive combinatorics was running late, and Grace had asked her son to sit in the back until she finished mopping the lower hallway. "No questions," she had whispered, tucking a strand of hair behind his ear. "Just watch. Be still." Noah obeyed, but he didn't just watch, he absorbed. On the board stood a problem that had eluded mathematicians for decades, the capset problem. Noah had seen the phrase before, scrawled in the margins of a battered algebra text, but never in context. Never like this. Find the maximum size of a subset of Z mod 3 to the power of n with no 3-term arithmetic progression. He didn't grasp every symbol. Not yet. But he saw something else. Patterns, geometries hidden within the notation, like folds in fabric, rotations no one seemed to be noticing. He opened a worn notebook, its pages yellowed and warped from years of use, and quietly began to write. That's when Professor Whitmore noticed him. Whitmore was a formidable presence, tall, silver-haired, his voice honed by decades of lecturing. He had little patience for distractions, not from his students, and certainly not from Janitor's children. "Excuse me," he said, fixing his gaze on the boy. "This is a graduate-level seminar. You need to leave." Noah looked up, not afraid, not defensive, simply still. "My mom is cleaning downstairs," he replied softly. "Then wait outside." A few students exchanged glances. One, a dark-haired girl named Emily Carter, opened her mouth as if to object, then thought better of it. Noah closed his notebook, gathered his things, and started walking toward the door. And that was when Whitmore muttered it, half under his breath, but loud enough for the room to hear. "You don't even know what Mod 3 means." It was meant to be final. Dismissive. The door clicked shut behind Noah. The next morning, something unusual happened. On Professor Whitmore's desk lay a folded sheet of paper, unmarked, slipped under his door sometime during the night. He unfolded it slowly. Inside, diagrams. Points plotted in 3-dimensional space. combinatorial notes in sharp, deliberate handwriting, and at the bottom a line scrawled in red pencil. Maybe it's not about avoiding lines. Maybe it's about folding space. Whitmore frowned. He glanced at the handwriting, then at his stack of student submissions. None matched. For a long time he sat motionless, the sun rising slowly over Harvard Yard. Outside, beyond his window, a woman pushed a mop bucket along the cobblestones, her son trailing quietly behind. That evening in their small apartment, Noah sat cross-legged on the carpet, surrounded by towers of books. They weren't sorted, they weren't shelved, just stacked, like tiny fortresses, each one holding some hidden spark waiting to be found. Grace arrived home from her second shift, the scent of disinfectant lingering faintly on her sleeves. "How many pages tonight?" she asked, weaving carefully between the stacks. 117, Noah said, lifting a thick paperback titled Introductory Number Theory. The cover was half torn, but he handled it like glass. Was any of it fun? Grace smiled tiredly. The part about quadratic residues, he replied. They reflect like mirrors in modular arithmetic. Most people memorize them, but they're like a game if you really see it. Grace blinked. Is that good? Noah smiled. It's beautiful. She ruffled his hair, then sank onto the couch with a long sigh. They asked you to leave the room today, she said quietly. Noah didn't answer. Why didn't you wait in the hallway like I said? He turned a page. Because it was the capset problem, he whispered. Grace furrowed her brow. The what? A pattern problem in three-dimensional mod space. You're not allowed to form lines, but they don't tell you how to place the dots. They ask how many you can place without making one. She looked at him as if he'd spoken another language. Do you understand it? Not all of it, but I saw something. Something I hadn't seen in the other books. He flipped to the back of his notebook and began sketching. Circles, dots, layers. Then he folded the paper in thirds, unfolded it to reveal a kind of cube, a rotation of points. What if we're not just placing them on a flat surface? What if there's another axis? What if the space itself isn't flat? Grace watched, bemused. You sound like your father. Noah looked up. He used to draw patterns on napkins during dinner, she said softly. He called it chasing shadows. Never finished, though. Noah said nothing, just kept folding, kept thinking. That night, after Grace had fallen asleep, Noah sat by the window, flashlight tucked beneath a blanket so the neighbors wouldn't see. He gathered every note he had ever made on the capset problem, every failed guess, every odd diagram, and began again. One fold, two folds, then a diagonal. It's not flat, he whispered to the quiet room. In a janitor's break room beneath Maxwell Hall, the hum of an old vending machine filled the silence. Noah sat hunched over a folding table, his fingers weaving carefully across graph paper. Not writing, not exactly. More like feeling his way through something no textbook had ever explained. The structure of a problem is often altered by the dimension in which it is viewed. A line from an old book stuck in his mind. Maybe we're thinking too flat. Across campus, Professor Whitmore stared at the folded page on his desk, still unfolded. He hadn't thrown it away. He couldn't. The diagrams weren't ramblings. They were intentional, precise. And that final line, folding space, it bothered him. He pulled open a drawer, retrieved an old article on the capset problem, an article he had written years ago. No mention of dimensions beyond 3, no serious attempt to fold the framework itself. Coincidence? He murmured. Yet something inside him said, perhaps not. and sow the seed of a most unlikely collaboration between a professor and a janitor's son had quietly begun to take root. Professor Samuel Whitmore sat alone in his office the next evening. The folded page from the janitor's son lay open before him, its crisp creases forming faint shadows on the wood grain of his desk. Folding space. He traced the words with his finger. The diagrams weren't random. The points were deliberate, arranged as if by someone who saw through the surface of the problem. Not a solution. Not yet. But something no one had dared suggest. Whitmore leaned back, rubbing his temples. It had been years since the capset problem had kept him awake. He had long resigned it to the unsolved, a curiosity for the archives. Yet now this crude diagram had reopened the question in his mind. He looked toward the window. The faint outline of Grace Bennett and her son crossed the cobblestones below. Coincidence, he muttered again, though he no longer believed it. Meanwhile, in the basement of Maxwell Hall, Noah Bennett sat at a dented folding table beside the janitor's carts. His small hands moved across graph paper, folding and unfolding, sketching patterns in the dim light of an aging desk lamp. "It's not about lines," he whispered. "It's about folds." On one sheet, he drew a triangle, then folded the paper twice, overlaying it with a rotated version of itself. A strange symmetry emerged, one that danced across dimensions. Not just position, memory. "What if space remembers?" he wrote in the margin. The hum of the vending machine filled the silence, steady as a heartbeat. Grace was mopping the east corridor upstairs. Before leaving, she had told him gently, "Stay out of sight. Light low. Shoes off the table." He had obeyed. But resting was the last thing on his mind. The structure of a problem is often altered by the dimension in which it is viewed. That line played on repeat in his head. Somewhere in his battered books, it had lodged itself, a stubborn seed now blooming wildly. He wasn't trying to solve the capset problem the same way everyone else had. He was trying to change the rules. Across campus, Professor Whitmore flipped through his old research on the problem. Bounds, polynomial methods, all elegant, all limited. None had suggested folding space. He stared again at the boy's note. Maybe it's not about avoiding lines. Maybe it's about folding space. Folding space. Into what? He whispered. Into memory? Into new adjacency? An idea, half-formed, maddening, stirred at the edges of his thoughts. "Coincidence," he said once more. But this time his voice carried less certainty. The following night, room 2011 was empty. Noah stood in the doorway, hesitant. The seminar wasn't scheduled. The door had been left ajar. His mother was 3 floors below, cleaning. He glanced around, then quietly slipped inside. The large whiteboard loomed at the front of the room, blank and inviting. Noah climbed to the back row, notebook in hand. He stared at the board, folding and unfolding the space within his mind. What if points aren't fixed, he thought. What if adjacency isn't just about where points are, but about what they remember? He began to sketch. A cube bent into a spiral, points layered, connected not by straight lines but by echoes through folded dimensions. Not just space, not just time, both. He smiled. It wasn't a proof, but it was a question worth asking. "You again." Noah froze. The voice came from the doorway. Professor Whitmore stepped inside, flipping on the main lights. His coat hung over one shoulder, face unreadable. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Noah swallowed. "I'm sorry. I just needed the board." Whitmore walked closer, studying the shapes on the board. This is a restricted classroom. I know, Noah whispered. He should have left, but something inside him held firm. I think I saw something, he said softly. In the cap set, the folds, they mirror like modular shadows. If you tilt the grid, some points repeat, not across lines, across layers. Whitmore blinked. What did you say? Noah opened his notebook, hands trembling slightly, and held it out. Pages of diagrams, circles, spirals, notes in a careful, deliberate hand. Axis tilt, nonlinear adjacency, rotation symmetry, and Z mod 3. Whitmore turned a page, then another, then stopped. Who taught you this? Noah shook his head. No one, just books and shapes. For a long moment, Whitmore said nothing. Then quietly, he handed the notebook back. You said the space isn't flat. Yes, sir? Prove it. Noah hesitated. I don't have a proof, just an idea. Then refine it. At the door, Whitmore paused. Next week, Wednesday. Seminar at 7 p.m. Be in the back again. Don't interrupt, don't speak, but bring your ideas. And with that, he left. Noah stood alone, staring at the chalk in his hand. He wasn't sure what had just happened. But maybe, just maybe, he had been invited to stay. The week that followed felt like a held breath. Noah hardly slept. By day, he devoured old textbooks, copying diagrams, folding and refolding paper until the creases wore thin. By night, he returned again and again to the question, what if adjacency isn't about position? What if it's about memory? What if space remembers folds? Grace noticed the change in him. You're different this week, she said one evening, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Do you want me to stay close? Noah shook his head. Just let me try. She kissed his forehead, her eyes soft with worry, and something more. Pride. Wednesday arrived. Room 2011 was half full when Noah entered quietly through the back door. His notebook felt heavier than usual in his backpack. He sat in the last row, didn't speak, didn't need to. At 7:03, Professor Whitmore entered. The room fell silent. Today, he began, chalk in hand, we revisit the cap set problem. No groans, no sighs, just attentive eyes. Previously, we've explored bounds, polynomial methods, the 2016 breakthrough by Kroot, Lev, and Ellenberg. But today, I want to consider a less conventional approach. He paused, then wrote 4 words on the board. What if space folds? A ripple passed through the room, raised eyebrows, a quiet snort, a few intrigued smiles. Whitmore continued, sketching triangles folding into cubes, grids bending across implied axes, mirror-symmetric point clusters. Noah's heart pounded. These were his ideas, his folds, his shadows. Now, Whitmore said, tapping the board, this isn't a solution, but it suggests an extension, a transformation of how we even define adjacency in a modular lattice. For a brief moment, his gaze flicked toward the back of the room. A flicker, a nod that didn't quite reach his chin. Then he turned back to the board. After class, students gathered around the front, buzzing with questions. No one noticed the boy slipping quietly out the side door. Noah didn't stop walking until he reached the quiet hallway outside the east stairwell. Only then did he pause and smile. Perhaps, just perhaps, he had been heard. The following morning, Professor Samuel Whitmore entered his office earlier than usual. The lecture from the night before lingered in his thoughts, not the parts he had presented, but the questions he hadn't yet voiced aloud. What if space folds? A simple phrase. Dangerous even. He had debated all night whether to share it, yet there it was, written plainly on the board. He set his briefcase down and glanced toward the door. There, slipped beneath it once more, another folded page. Unfolding it carefully, he found new diagrams, triangles within triangles, cubes spiraling inward, then outward again, and beneath them, a single line. What if adjacency isn't just about position? What if it's about memory? Whitmore sat back. Memory? He turned the page sideways, then upside down. Number. The shapes weren't arbitrary. They followed a rhythm, a logic not yet formalized but undeniably intentional. Coincidence, he whispered once more, though the word was losing its meaning. Across campus, in the janitor's storage room beneath Maxwell Hall, Noah Bennett worked under the hum of an ancient computer. The machine groaned with each file he opened, a battered relic of the department's forgotten inventory. Beside him sat a small flash drive, a gift from Emily Carter. Here, she had said after the lecture, you'll need more than books. She hadn't asked how he understood the folds. She hadn't asked why he had been in the seminar. She had simply handed him the drive, a knowing look in her eyes. Now Noah clicked through its contents. Over 200 research theses, some decades old, some newer than the flickering bulb overhead. He didn't read them line by line. He searched for shadows, margins filled with questions, diagrams that hinted at something more. Again and again, he returned to the capset problem. We cannot solve this by counting differently. We must see differently. A line from an old thesis caught his eye. Dated 1994. Author, Samuel Whitmore. Noah stared at the name. The introduction was uncharacteristically personal for a math paper, the tone raw, almost vulnerable, trying to see the invisible order behind randomness. Noah leaned back, the words sinking deep. He once believed this, he whispered. What changed? He printed the page, folded it carefully, and added it to his growing stack of notes. That night, after Grace had fallen asleep, Noah returned to room 2011. The door was unlocked again, the whiteboard clean, save for a faint trace of the previous lecture. He climbed to the back row and opened his notebook. Not just points, not just lines, layers. He drew in silence, building a structure of folds and echoes, a triangle within a spiral, points connected by invisible threads, not across flat space, but through imagined layers of memory. He erased one symbol, shifted another. The entire pattern flexed. It's not adjacency, he thought. It's remembering. At the end, he copied the most promising diagram onto a fresh sheet, folded it carefully, and once again, slipped it beneath Professor Whitmore's office door. The next morning, Whitmore stared at the new page, eyes tired, mind racing. Memory is shape, the boy had written in the margin. Shape remembers folds. He hadn't written a proof, not even close, but each diagram asked something, demanded a response. For the first time in years, Whitmore reached for an old red pen, not to correct, to answer. Beneath the boy's line, he wrote, "What if memory is distance between patterns?" He folded the page with deliberate care and placed it at the edge of his desk. The next night, a new page arrived, and so it began, a silent conversation. Each evening, Noah slipped a folded diagram under Whitmore's door. Each morning, a marked-up version returned, annotated in precise red script. No names, no signatures, just shapes, questions, a language of folds. Emily noticed first. "Something's changing," she said one afternoon, catching up to Whitmore in the hallway. "What do you mean?" "Your lectures. You pause now, like you're about to ask a question you've already answered in private." Whitmore allowed himself a faint smile. "Perhaps I am." In the janitor's storage room, Noah worked late into the night. Stacks of folded pages surrounded him, forming a small nest of ideas. Grace noticed, too. One evening, she brought him a bowl of soup. "Eat, sweetheart," she said, setting it gently beside his elbow. He didn't look up, fingers tracing patterns across two overlaid diagrams. Grace watched him for a long moment, then leaned down and kissed the top of his head. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, "even if no one else sees this." Noah smiled faintly. "Someone does," he said softly. "One is enough." That weekend, Professor Whitmore canceled his Friday seminar. Instead, he remained in his office, studying the latest page. This time, Noah had sent more than a diagram, a sequence, a method to represent modular sets, not by position, but by time. Adjacency as an echo across folded dimensions. "This is no longer a sketch," Whitmore thought. "This is a framework." He leaned back, stunned. The implications rippled through his mind. "If a child finishes this, the world may not believe it." Slowly, he rose and approached the chalkboard. At the top, in neat script, he wrote, "Noah Bennett." Beneath it, "Co-theorist, collaborator, ghost." For now, it was enough. The following Wednesday, Whitmore stood before room 2011 once more. The seminar began as usual, but his tone had shifted. "Today we revisit adjacency," he announced, "through a different lens." He sketched Noah's latest construction, layer by layer. "This is an anonymous contribution," he said, "unpublished, but worth exploring." A murmur passed through the room. Emily leaned forward, eyes wide. A student whispered, "Is this even allowed?" Whitmore didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his chalk and drew a layered symbol, not an equation, but an invitation to think. Beneath it, he wrote simply, "Adjacency as memory," then stepped back. "It holds." No one clapped. No one laughed. They leaned forward, drawn in by the folds. At the back of the room, one seat sat empty. That evening, a new folded page arrived at Whitmore's door. No diagram, no equations, just a question. What makes a mathematician? Whitmore stared at it for a long moment. Then, with a steady hand, picked up his red pen and wrote, "Whoever asks the question no one else thought to ask." It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when the email finally arrived. Subject, Temporary Access Authorization. Departmental Visitor Center, Harvard Mathematics Administration. The body was brief. Noah Bennett has been granted a 1-week visitor badge for limited academic observation. Access restricted to Maxwell Hall only. Supervision required. Professor Samuel Whitmore stared at the screen, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had rewritten the request 3 times. The final version was careful, clinical, just vague enough to be approved. Unofficial contributor, anonymous collaboration, potential educational value. And now, it was done. He folded his hands, exhaled slowly. For the first time in months, he felt the faint pull of hope. Grace Bennett didn't react at first when Whitmore knocked gently on their apartment door that evening. Noah sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by folded diagrams. Grace opened the envelope, her fingers trembling as she traced the Harvard seal at the top. "This is for Noah," she whispered. Whitmore nodded. 1 week. Official. He can attend. She sat down, breath shallow. "He's only 11. "I know," Whitmore said softly, "but his mind isn't." Behind her, Noah clutched his notebook, expression unreadable. "Will I have to talk?" he asked. Whitmore shook his head. "Just listen, observe, and show me what you see." Grace met his gaze. And if someone laughs at him, then they will have misunderstood the lesson. For a long moment, Grace said nothing. Then she smiled faintly. He gets that from his father, you know. Seeing what others miss. Whitmore inclined his head. It seems he also gets the courage to show it. Monday came. Noah stood at the front gate of Maxwell Hall, a maroon lanyard around his neck. The word visitor was printed in bold black letters. Some students stared. A few nodded politely. Most ignored him. But when he stepped into room 2011 and took his seat in the back row, this time not hiding, he felt something shift. He belonged. Not because they said so, because the board no longer frightened him. That day's lecture was dense. Advanced group theory extensions related to additive combinatorics. Noah followed each line carefully, notebook open, diagrams already forming in his mind. Midway through, Professor Whitmore paused, set down his chalk, turned to the back of the room. "Noah," he said quietly, "would you care to join me?" A murmur rippled through the class. No one protested. They had seen the diagrams, the shifts in their professor's tone. Noah hesitated, then stood, notebook in hand, and walked to the front. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from something else. Responsibility. He opened the notebook to a page marked with a red paperclip, held it up. Whitmore glanced at it, nodded, then handed him the chalk. Noah drew slowly, a modular symmetry that transformed through iterative memory steps. Lines curved gently, suggesting time, not just space. At last, he circled 3 points. "These aren't adjacent," he said softly, "but they remember each other." No one laughed, no one questioned. They leaned forward, drawn in. One student whispered, "What does that even mean?" Emily Carter smiled. "It means we need to start over." That night, Grace picked Noah up from campus. He said little on the walk home. At the door, he handed her the visitor badge. She turned it over in her hand. "Did you like it?" "I like the chalk," he said. "It feels different." She chuckled. "Only you would notice that." "Mom," Noah said suddenly, "if I don't get to stay after this week, would you be disappointed?" Grace stopped, knelt before him. "No, sweetheart. I'd be proud because you walked in with your head up and showed them who you are." Noah nodded slowly. Then, for the first time in days, he smiled. Later that evening, Professor Whitmore returned to his office. On his desk lay a new folded page. This time, no diagram, no equations, just 2 lines in red pencil. "Memory is shape. Proof is permission." Whitmore stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, reverently, he picked up his pen and began to write. Friday morning arrived with a hush over Maxwell Hall, the kind of quiet that comes before something irreversible. Noah sat once more in the back of room 2011, visitor badge tucked discreetly beneath his hoodie, a new notebook in his lap, its first page still blank. He hadn't written anything yet. He was waiting. Professor Whitmore entered precisely at 7 a.m. No notes, no textbook, only a single piece of chalk. "Today," he said, voice calm, "we're going to talk about names." Confused glances, a few furrowed brows. "Mathematics is supposed to be anonymous," he continued. "Equations don't care who wrote them, but we do. Because names carry weight, sometimes too much, sometimes not enough." He turned to the board and wrote one name in clear script: Noah Bennett. Silence. "You've seen his work. You just didn't know it. The folding symmetries, the echo models, the dimensional adjacency constructs, those weren't mine." He let the words settle. "They came from someone without credentials, without status, but not without merit. A student raised a hand hesitantly. Is he a prodigy? Whitmore shook his head. Number. He's a mathematician. At the back of the room, Noah stared at his name on the board. For a moment, he thought he might disappear. But he didn't. He stayed. Whitmore turned to him. Would you like to share your latest model? Noah rose slowly, walked to the front. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from understanding the moment. He opened his new notebook. If memory is distance and distance folds, then adjacency becomes choice. Then he drew, not numbers, not letters. Space itself, reshaped. The room didn't erupt. There were no standing ovations, just a silence deeper than any applause, the kind of silence reserved for truth. That evening, Grace was called into the office of Harvard's academic affairs director. She expected a reprimand. What she received was an offer. We'd like to enroll your son in a special independent study program, the woman said. He would attend in a limited capacity, with mentorship. Professor Whitmore has volunteered to supervise. Grace looked down at the paper. We can't afford this, she whispered. It's fully funded. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth. That night, as she watched Noah sleep on the couch, his notebook resting on his chest, she reached down and opened to the first page. Written softly in the margin, for Mom. Because you cleaned the room I learned in. She closed the notebook gently and wept. It was raining the morning Noah returned to Maxwell Hall, not as a visitor, not as someone waiting quietly in the back, but as a registered independent scholar. His badge was different now. It didn't say visitor. It said affiliate. One word, but it felt as if a continent had shifted beneath his feet. Grace held his umbrella as they walked up the worn stone steps. Are you sure you want to do this? She asked softly. Noah nodded. Then remember one thing, she said, eyes warm. Your worth doesn't come from a badge or a board. It comes from what you choose to see and share. He hugged her tightly, then stepped inside. The hallways of Maxwell felt different, not because they had changed, but because he had. Noah walked past the janitor's closet where he used to read under dim bulbs, past the vending machine that had buzzed through so many of his nights, past the hallway where he had first slipped a folded paper beneath a locked door, and finally, into room 2011. Emily Carter waved from the second row. She had saved him a seat. Professor Whitmore stood at the board, back turned as always. But when Noah entered, he paused for half a beat. Then continued. That day's topic was abstract modular transformations. But it wasn't the math that everyone would remember. It was what came after. At the end of class, Whitmore set down his chalk. There's something we haven't done yet, he said. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the far corner of the room. There, affixed to the wall, was a newly mounted bronze plaque. Its inscription read, This space honors Noah Bennett, whose questions folded the silence. No one clapped, but the air held reverence. Noah didn't speak. He didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, Noah settled into a rhythm. Mornings in classes, afternoons in a small office off the East Wing, a space that had once been a janitor's supply closet. He had insisted they not change it too much. Just paint it, he said. Leave the old brass hook on the door. For memory. Grace still cleaned the halls, but her badge now read, Administrative Custodian, Academic Liaison. When asked in an interview if she was proud her son was now a Harvard researcher, she smiled. I was proud when he was drawing on cardboard boxes. That quote spread quickly online. She didn't know until a professor from Germany emailed her a thank you letter. Meanwhile, the folded diagrams began to travel. Professor Whitmore included portions of Noah's models in his lectures, always crediting him now. Conceptual framework proposed by Noah Bennett, he would write in the corner of the board. Papers were written, some with Whitmore's name, some with Noah's, one with both. Not everyone accepted it. Some questioned the legitimacy, others called it myth-making, but no one could deny the work. Noah's models began appearing in upper-level combinatorics textbooks, footnoted, cited. A method once scribbled in red pencil, one text remarked, now shaping new perspectives in modular adjacency. And through it all, Noah never stopped folding. One afternoon, after a guest lecture at the Clay Mathematics Institute, still the youngest speaker they had ever invited, Noah returned to his small office. On his desk sat a small leather box, no return address, just a handwritten note. For the board that never forgot you. Inside the box, a single piece of white chalk. The handwriting was familiar. It was his own. He had written the note months earlier, intending to remind himself of something simple. The answer isn't the end. It's where the next question waits. As Noah's presence at Harvard grew, Professor Whitmore's role began to shift. He lectured less, mentored more, walked the halls quietly. Sometimes he would stop outside Noah's door, listening to the faint rhythm of chalk on board. He never knocked. He didn't need to. Noah always left the door open. One rainy February afternoon, Whitmore didn't show up for his usual walk. Concerned, Noah made his way to the professor's office. The light was off, the door ajar. On the desk sat a single envelope with Noah's name. Inside, some truths aren't solved. They're handed forward. You're ready. The key was never the proof. It was always the question. Beneath that, in smaller script, P.S. There's a letter in the bottom drawer. It's not mine, but I kept it for you. Noah opened the drawer. Inside, a faded envelope, addressed, to the one who sees the space between. The handwriting was older, wobblier. It was from his father. Grace had never spoken much about him. Noah knew only that he had been a dreamer, a man who once studied math but never finished school, who had once walked the halls of MIT, not as a student, but as a part-time janitor, always sketching patterns on napkins during lunch breaks. The letter wasn't long. The world doesn't always need more answers. Sometimes it needs more people willing to look between them. It ended. If you're reading this, it means you found it. Not the letter. The language. Noah folded it carefully, placed it inside his notebook, then walked to class. Months passed, not in great leaps, but in quiet folds, like the pages of the notebook Noah never stopped carrying. By the time he turned 16, the visitor badge had long been replaced by a worn Harvard ID, and room 2011 no longer turned when he walked in. He had become part of the building, familiar, like the creak of the chairs or the warmth of the afternoon light through the high windows. But familiarity didn't mean forgotten. It meant accepted. To this day, if you walk into room 2011 during the quiet hours, when the sunlight hits the board just right, you can still faintly see it. Noah Bennett, written beneath the layers of chalk. As if the room, like the rest of us, had learned to remember. Not the answer, but the boy who asked. Years passed, not in grand leaps, but in quiet folds, like the pages of the notebook Noah never stopped carrying. By the time he turned 16, the word visitor was a memory. His Harvard ID, worn at the edges, simply read, Affiliate Scholar. Room 2011 no longer turned when he entered. He was part of the place now, as familiar as the creak of the chairs or the warm light through the high windows. But familiarity didn't mean forgotten. It meant accepted. Noah never liked the spotlight. He preferred chalk to microphones, diagrams to debates. He published fewer papers than expected, but the ones he did write, co-authored with Whitmore or independently, were studied for years. Proof is permission, he would write in the margins, but memory is meaning. His folded adjacency model didn't replace existing combinatorics methods. It reframed them. Not adjacency as position, but adjacency as remembered structure. It was subtle, elegant, and difficult to teach because it wasn't born of formulas alone. It was born of intuition, of folds. Emily Carter became one of its early advocates. Now a graduate student herself, she often cited Noah's work in her lectures. "We were looking for new numbers," she would tell students. "But Noah showed us. Sometimes the space between the numbers matters more." When asked about him, she always smiled. "He taught us how to listen to the silence." Grace watched her son's quiet ascent with a kind of reverent detachment. She still cleaned the halls, though now with a badge that read, Academic Liaison. One reporter asked if she was proud that her son had become a published researcher. "I was proud when he folded paper on the kitchen floor," she said. That quote, too, traveled. She didn't know until a letter arrived from a retired mathematician in Tokyo. "Thank you for reminding us that wonder matters." Professor Whitmore grew quieter as Noah grew louder, not in volume, in confidence. He no longer lectured 5 days a week. He mentored, he walked, he listened. Sometimes he would pause outside Noah's door, listening to the familiar rhythm of chalk on board. He never knocked. He didn't need to. Noah always left the door open. One autumn afternoon, Noah presented a new extension of his model at the Clay Institute, the youngest speaker they had ever invited. After the talk, a senior professor approached him. "You don't explain folds like a mathematician," she said. "You explain them like a storyteller." Noah smiled. "Maybe they're the same thing." Weeks later, he returned to his small office at Harvard. On his desk sat a small leather box and a note, "For the board that never forgot you." Inside, a single piece of white chalk, the same kind he had first used in room 2011. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting was familiar. His own, written months ago. The answer isn't the end. It's where the next question waits. One crisp winter morning, Noah taught his first seminar. Not formally, not scheduled. Just a handful of students, curious, hopeful, who had heard of the folds. He didn't start with equations. "Before we begin," he said softly, "I want you to fold this." He handed each student a blank sheet of paper. "No diagrams, no numbers, just fold, and watch what changes." Puzzled, they complied. Then he smiled. "Now, imagine your data does the same." It wasn't about the paper. It was about the space it created, the memory it carried. That afternoon, Grace waited for him outside Maxwell Hall. "How was your first class?" Noah smiled. "They folded." "And did they understand?" "Some did. Some didn't." "That's okay." "Why?" she asked. Noah looked at her, eyes bright. "Because the space between understanding, that's where the next question lives." Grace hugged him tight. "You still sound like your father." "Maybe that's the best part of me." Later that evening, Noah returned to room 2011. The board was empty. The room bathed in soft golden light. He picked up a piece of chalk, stood in silence. Then, slowly, he wrote, "If space remembers the fold, so should we." He set the chalk down gently and left the door open behind him. Across Harvard, across the world, Noah's diagrams continued to travel, sometimes published, sometimes left behind, folded pages with no name. "Who wrote this?" a student would ask. "Noah Bennett. I thought he didn't sign his work." He doesn't, but the folds remember. In room 2011, when the sunlight comes in just right, you can still see it, faint beneath the layers of chalk. Noah Bennett, not the answer. But the boy who taught us to ask. Noah's folded framework continued to travel, further than he had ever imagined. At first, it appeared quietly in seminar footnotes. Adjacency memory models, Bennett W. Some papers began to cite, subtle, almost whispered. Then came the lectures, Cambridge, Princeton, Kyoto. A framework for non-linear adjacency in modular combinatorics, one talk was titled. Folding space, remembering structure, another. Noah attended few of these talks himself. He didn't need to. The folds spoke for him. One rainy morning, a letter arrived at Grace's apartment. No return address. Inside, a crisp white envelope. Harvard crest embossed. A single note. "We are honored to invite Mr. Noah Bennett to keynote the International Conference on Advanced Combinatorics." Grace read it twice before calling Noah over. "It's for you," she whispered, her voice shaking. Noah read it in silence, then looked up. "Should I go?" Grace smiled. "Go, but don't forget who you are when you do." "I won't," he promised. At the conference, Noah's talk was simple. Director. "Adjacency," he began softly, "is often defined by where things are." He held up a folded page. "But sometimes what matters is not position, but memory, what has touched, what remembers." He unfolded the paper, showed the traces left behind, creases that held invisible connections. "If space remembers the fold, so should we." The room was silent. When he finished, an elderly professor rose slowly. "Young man," she said, "you didn't just give us a new model. You gave us a new question." Noah smiled. "That's all I ever hoped to do." Upon returning to Harvard, Noah found an envelope waiting in his office. Familiar handwriting. Professor Whitmore. Inside, a single sentence. "Some truths aren't solved. They're handed forward. You're ready?" Beneath it, "Come see me." Later that evening, Noah visited Whitmore's office. The room was dimly lit. Stacks of books lined the shelves. Whitmore looked older, quieter. "Sit," he said softly. Noah did. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Whitmore reached into a drawer and pulled out an old envelope. "I've kept this for you," he said. "Your father left it here. I wasn't sure when or if you would be ready." Noah took the envelope with trembling hands. "To the one who sees the space between." The handwriting was faded, wobbly. Grace had spoken of him rarely, a man who once chased patterns but never chased prestige. Noah unfolded the letter. The world will always ask for answers, but sometimes it needs more people brave enough to ask new questions, to see between what is and what could be. If you're reading this, you've already begun. Noah read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his notebook. Whitmore watched him quietly. "What will you do now?" he asked. Noah looked up. "I'll keep folding." Whitmore smiled faintly. "Then my work here is done." He stood slowly, offered his hand. Noah shook it, firmly, with quiet gratitude. In the weeks that followed, Noah's presence at Harvard remained steady, but different. He lectured occasionally, mentored quietly, listened often. Room 2011 became a quiet place of gathering. Students would linger after class, folding paper, sketching ideas, exploring the space between. Noah never corrected them harshly. He simply asked, "What do you think the fold remembers?" and waited. One crisp spring morning, Noah returned to room 2011 alone. The board was empty. He picked up a piece of chalk, wrote a single line. The question matters more than the proof. Then set the chalk down gently and left the door open behind him. That afternoon, Emily Carter found him sitting beneath the old maple in Harvard Yard. "You've changed this place," she said softly. Noah shook his head. "I've only reminded it to ask." Letters began to arrive from across the world. "Your framework helped us visualize adjacency in new dimensions," one professor wrote. "Your folds gave our students new ways to think," another said. But the letter that mattered most arrived on a quiet Thursday from MIT. "Your father's folded notes were archived here. We would like to share them with you." Noah read the email twice, hands trembling. He closed his laptop, sat in silence. "Not solved," he whispered, handed forward. Later that evening, he returned to room 2011 once more, traced the old bronze plaque with his fingers. "This space honors Noah Bennett, whose questions folded the silence." Then beneath it, he left a small folded page. No name, just a line. "For those who dare to fold next." And in that quiet room, the folds remained. Not the answer, but the language, waiting. It had been almost a year since Professor Samuel Whitmore had retired. Room 2011 had a new professor now, young, brilliant, eager. But some things remained. On the far wall, the bronze plaque still gleamed softly. "This space honors Noah Bennett, whose questions folded the silence." And every so often, beneath the layers of chalk, Noah's faint handwriting would reappear. If space remembers the fold, so should we. Noah no longer attended every seminar. He came when he could. He mentored quietly, listened more than he spoke. His models had traveled far, adapted, evolved. Folding adjacency frameworks, some called them. Memory-based modular analysis, others said. But Noah still called them what they had always been: questions. One crisp autumn morning, a small group of first-year students gathered in room 2011. They had heard whispers of the fold. Some had seen the plaque. Others had found old diagrams online. They asked for guidance. Noah agreed. "Before we begin," he said softly, "take a sheet of paper." Confused, they complied. "Now fold it, any way you like. But notice this: no fold ever fully disappears. It remembers." He smiled gently. "Math is like that. So is life." The students folded, laughed, explored, and Noah watched, not as a teacher above, but as a fellow traveler beside. Later that afternoon, Grace arrived at Maxwell Hall. She still wore her badge, academic liaison. But these days, she came more to watch than to work. "How was the session?" she asked, handing Noah a small lunch. "They folded well," he smiled. "And you?" "I'm still folding." Grace laughed softly. "Some things never change." Noah looked at her, eyes shining. "Some things shouldn't." That evening, as twilight bathed Harvard Yard in soft gold, Noah returned alone to room 2011. The room was empty, quiet. He stood for a long moment before the board, then picked up a single piece of chalk. "The answer isn't the end," he wrote slowly. "It's where the next question waits." He set the chalk down gently, folded a small piece of paper, placed it beneath the plaque, then turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. "Thank you," he whispered softly, for letting me ask. Across the world, the folds continue to travel, in lecture halls, in whispered discussions, in margins of papers. Sometimes a student would find an unsigned folded page, just a diagram, and a single line. What if space remembers the fold? And in room 2011, on quiet afternoons when the sunlight came in just right, one could still see it. Noah Bennett, faint beneath the layer of chalk, not the answer, but the boy who reminded us to fold, to remember, to ask. The end.